This is a commentary. I guess I can't really call it a response, but maybe it's a little bit of a response to some of the subject matter that I must apologize in advance. I'm very bad at pronouncing certain names. Daniel Schmachtenberger. Anyway, yeah. So he was on the Stoa and he was talking about an abstract problem, um, but also one that's relevant to thematically to a lot of issues, and that is something like uh, converting Moloch from the Sith to the Jedi, sort of making Moloch. How is there a way? Is there a form in which Moloch can be converted into an angelic force, and Moloch representing a kind of this essentially. I hope I if I get some of these labels wrong, I hope that someone will just read the correct ones, because I don't actually know all the proper terminology of game A and game B. But I believe game A is the one that we currently inhabit, the competitive one. So essentially, the idea is that, and game B is the non-competitive game, essentially, which is what we want to sort of get to. Now, I agree with all the stuff about the games. I agree with a lot of the thinking around this, but there was something that caught my ear as problematic, and I want to sort of go into that. And I do think that this theme might be some of the key to some of these abstract issues as well. So there are some formulations of problems which Daniel makes, which I think are how to phrase this. This is a problem that I think is a recurring problem, which comes with modeling problems. When you try to generalize and abstract how to create procedures or methods, um, and when you describe types of problems, you have to be very careful about what you're leaving unquantified, as it were. Because if you want to create the security of sort of protecting against an unknown quantity, I think you've actually produced something like the Moloch feature in games. You're depending on um, a heuristic. You're depending on a kind of a fundamentally fudging feature, which then locks you into um, some kind of game A scenario, essentially. And I'm going to illustrate this soon. So, essentially, the thing that caught my ear was when Daniel was talking about uh, power, power asymmetries, and he was talking about evolution. So he's like, evolution breaks down when you have certain asymmetries of power scaling. Um, Now, you see, that's fine as a general statement. But when you phrase it as a grievance, as a problem, right? I think you really do get into an issue where you stop seeing the wood from the trees. The I mean, I'll just say, just as a substantive point, that I don't think disparity is the kind of problem that it's that was intimated by that kind of phraseology and that kind of description. I don't think disparity is the boogeyman that people think it is, in the kind of stark and hysterical narrative that Daniel sort of drew in some sense, or perhaps hysterical is the wrong adjective, but stark. He expressed it in a stark sense. And I'm afraid that it's open-ended in a wrong way. Okay, so let me just try and tease this out. The grievance of disparity is not relevant in as if itself, in as if the disparity itself is not relevant. It must be quantified uh, uh, in a certain sense and not remain an unknown quantity. Now, essentially, Daniel did tether it to essentially the breakdown of evolution. Now, I think that this is not a quantification, that's merely correlating a grievance with a grievance. So you've got one distillation of a grievance and you're tethering it and correlating it to another general grievance. And so together they have actually self corroborated themselves as a kind of, well, now you know what evil is. Now you know what the problem is. It's these two things. So we just need to create a world in which these two factors don't come into an alignment with each other. We have to keep them separated, and that sort of keeps you in the busy work of aligning in some rational sense a system that sort of keeps that from happening. And I think that is something, that's another way of describing what in fact is going on in the Moloch thing, but from an ontological perspective. I would say that this is the ontology of it. So I'm pointing that out as the problem. That essentially, this comes from, and let me just put it in the pure philosophical sense, is that grievances themselves can't be defined as the prime constituents of reality. In some sense, the grievance is only relevant if there is a particular redress to it. So you already have to have an idea of what the redress is for it to even be a grievance. If there is no redress, there is no grievance. And this is the problem with defining disparity as a disparity itself as a grievance, and then sort of corroborating it with the notion that, well, evolution breaking down, what does it even mean for evolution to break down? I mean, I think evolution as a model is itself, it's not a true model. It is a model, and it is true by definition in some sense, and it is a way of analyzing reality, and it is not a bad descriptive framework, but it is only a descriptive framework. It's not an explanatory framework. That's my contention, I guess. But I mean, if you decide to define reality as random mutation and selective pressure, everything can be put into one of those two categories, or some, maybe there'll be some components which are sort of are designated to be 60% selective pressure and sort of are a weird sort of middling ground, which actually I would say puts the whole spanner into the whole evolutionary model in some sense, because as soon as you've got anything that then breaks the mold of the canonical categorization, then essentially your reasoning will fail you. Essentially, if you can't say that this is a selective pressure and this is a random mutation, when you've got these gradients of when you've got that on a kind of spectrum, when you're dealing with certain features, then the model is not going to be useful. The model is not going to be you're not going to be able to use it to compute reliably what's going on. You're not going to be able to use it to analyze what's going on at all. In some sense, it only works if you can control for that kind of confusion by making sure that you sequestrate out all those middling elements. And then what are you left with? You're always left with a pristine deterministic system in which, yes, your evolutionary analysis applies, and what have you thrown out? What have you excluded? And you've probably excluded all the important questions anyway at that point. And you've sort of, it's like chemistry. It's like doing chemistry, and it's like, you're not dealing with reality. You're just dealing with a level of conceptualization, of description, which is good enough to help you do something instrumentally. But why are you trying to save a canonical form of analysis? Why are you trying to enshrine? Because without it, what? Without it, your mind doesn't have the same reach, doesn't have the same purview. So, in some sense, this is, in some sense, deeply significant of a lack of humility continuing to exacerbate itself and manifest as further lacks of humility and an escalation of the retraction of humility into a kind of doom spiral, which in some sense is a Moloch type issue, I think. Now, obviously, what I've just explored is is a meta sort of Moloch issue, and essentially in the same way that people don't want to countenance a world in which disparity is looming ever larger. I mean, this I think is a bit of a this is a bit of a narrative, of a bit of a cherry pick narrative as well. I'm sorry, I don't mean to bully Daniel. He's one of the best thinkers, I think, on a lot of issues. Really, he says amazing things a lot of the time. Anyway, but let me just, I'm taking him to task for this. So, um, well, I'm using this as an illustration to explore this deeper philosophical ground. What was I just about to say? Damn, I was just about to go somewhere. The escalation of the retraction of humility. And then I was just about to illustrate how not wanting to live in a world. The narrative, the cherry pick narrative. Okay, so what I would. Okay, so where essentially the story, the narrative, which Daniel is I hate to use these words, they sound so pejorative. I don't mean them in a mean spirited way, but the story that Daniel is peddling to sell this conceptual model, let's look at that. Okay, so what is the story? The story is that when we were hunter gatherers, one person in the tribe was never more strong than five people in the tribe. Or three, he actually used the word three, but I mean, I'm even I'm trying to steel man it. So essentially, if five people could always beat up one person, then it's sort of we're forced into a kind of there's asymmetry is contained enough that egregious uh, uh, excesses can be policed and monitored by the consensus formed um, by at least a group, a small band of people that agree that someone is too toxic or something like that. So, or okay, anyway, the idea that disparities. I'm just trying to attack this part of the story that essentially disparities were never vast. I think they always have been vast. Were just vast in ways in which, in immaterial ways. And when I say immaterial, I mean spiritual ways. I don't mean that they weren't important. I mean that they were important, but they are invisible. Um, Wisdom, intellect, knowledge, philosophy. Um, yes, philosophers can be killed, can be poisoned, can be thrown out by social norms, can be barred and captivated, um, or put into captivity, and bound, uh, um, and contorted by other immaterial features of a system. But that is always where the grand disparity has always existed. And in some sense, you could say that the asymmetrical curb on this has been a shared culture, or a kind of zeitgeist, or a kind of cauldron which includes things like religion and mythological belief. And I don't know if it came out in this, if I've just seen it recently. I don't think I heard Daniel say this, but I think I heard Eric Weinstein say this about Brett Weinstein, quoting him that no, it was Eric Weinstein quoting Jordan Peterson, that something like the only thing that explains war is archetype. The only thing that can explain how human beings can take themselves to war and can actually put themselves inside a war and into driving towards a war, into contemplating engaging in war, is the realm of archetype. And this has always been the realm that has canonically always contained vast disparity, and not even, of the disparity described by him, and in terms of the 3 billion people are conquered by a fusion bomb or something like that, but that uh, an infinite amount of immaturity cannot compare to an actual transcendental conceptual framework that's embodied or self-realized. Um, and the power of the understanding. Um, and so the rudiments of understanding, I think, well, I mean, I guess I'm cautioning him that there is a problem when one confects a kind of narrative in which one is essentially using the notion of grievance as a base material for constructing one's yeah, I can put this. Okay, I've pontificated a bit too much. Let me put this in a more practical illustration. For example, people. Why would people have to care about disparity? And in some sense, um, disparity is only actually problematic, you can say, because um, it's sort of there's a movie Snowpiercer where the people at the back of the train are a kind of like chattel slave class. You know, they don't even register in the class system. They were just sort of baggage, um, going along for the ride. So that's the illustration of essentially, I guess, the problem with that. If disparity grows, then you get that sort of like a kind of persistent slave class that sort of loses all their integrity and their dignity, and you've got a kind of runaway culture or a runaway system, which was driven, which the precursor of which down that path was disparity. I would say the only thing, in some sense, that whole framework is problematic already, because then essentially you're saying, well, the poor must be dependent on the strong, and therefore disparity must not grow, so that the poor can continue to be dependent on the strong, and force the strong to offer their facilitation of that dependency. Very problematic. The framework is problematic entirely. But let me just say that let's not phrase it in terms of the grievance. Let's phrase it in terms of the redress. What would the redress look like? The redress is, and I, in some sense, it doesn't actually have to be a complete redress. It doesn't have to be, oh, somebody else has to come and actually solve our problem. Because why is it that the strong should have to be the recipient of our grievance in the first place? Why can't we be the recipient of our grievance? So as long as potentially they can still be the recipient of their own grievance, I think I'm satisfied that essentially that they could have satisfied themselves if they just had the humility to actually sort themselves out. Essentially to not shirk the responsibility of avoiding or ducking or diving from the bootstrap solution, and essentially overlooking the bootstrap solution because there's some systemic narrative that they can sort of cast around themselves and depend on and depend off of. So essentially, to me, the actual grievance, as it were, or sorry, the actual redress that solves the problem is not, do they have this growing state of dependency? The question is, could they be self-reliant? Could people be self-reliant? And the answer to that question, and as long as the potential answer to that question is yes, then it's not a problem. Then the grievance is not relevant. So that is the watershed. In fact, when does dependency become, and this is what even the conservatives of years and years ago, they thought the most evil thing in the world was wage slavery. That's what they despised as the threat to the classical liberal framework, and that is in essence the only Marxist test there really is, the true Marxist test of whether you have to progress to something other, is when does access to the market become so impossible to essentially manage a kind of, like when I say self-reliance, obviously that's a relative term because self-reliance is contextualized in some sense, and that's a bit of a problem, that essentially, until we have Star Trek replicator machines, we're not going to individually be completely reliant until we know how to each individually make and maintain those replicating machines and have the energy to run them or something like that. But essentially, can you, as a group of people, essentially cobble together something that essentially has the same functionality as something that's good enough as a replicator machine? And I think that answer is yes. I think in some sense, the more sophisticated the market gets, the further we go along with technology and things like that, the further capitalism continues, the easier it is to extract the implements from capitalism that would supply one with self-sufficiency and a kind of autarchical security within some level of relative collaboration and coordination with other people. So the lack of that collaborative spirit, the lack of that ability to organize in some sense, this is not something that you can try to beg from the system. This is not a grievance that you can try to leverage against the container. That's a failing of your own liberal compunction to actually create and invent. I mean, I don't have a problem with revolutionaries. I have a problem with revolutionaries that try to do something with the state. Revolutionaries, they do have an important place. They should actually start being responsible, and they should stop creating narratives about systemic oppression, and they should work out actually how to create a self-sustaining culture that could do something as an alternative model to the market. And essentially they should do that without taking over the state, so that they actually need the market as an initial stepping stone to buy their freedom from the market, using the market, with the market, going along with the market until one essentially has enough internal capacity to not need the market, and then you don't need to override the market, and then essentially you can slowly, let's say, take over the market by displacing it voluntarily by people joining you in some sense, or imitating you, or joining the model that you create, right? So so the idea is not how vicious the game A people are, is not relevant relative to the meek people that wish that they could engage in game B. Those kinds of contrasts and generating abstract grievances from those kinds of contrasts are some sense I've described in some other of my political things that essentially I believe that liberalism and capitalism are the best containers for actual progress of even a radical sort, in that they must maintain their default constitutions and compositions. Obviously, I would rather have them have better legal systems, like the South African legal system, that has an actual solid basis to it, although it has been betrayed in recent years, and its legal theory has been corrupted by fascist legal positivists. But anyway, that sort of cultural noise aside, I want the rules of the game to be consistent and persist in a stringent way that safeguards in the same way that the Roman Republic never changed its rules effectively, like, even because their rules were also very permissive to respecting the real situation. There were laws about the tyrant about the tyrant displacing the republic even. So the system of law was honest enough that it could even calibrate its own. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. It could be honest about its own internal composition and give people a kind of, because in some sense real interests and real politics was woven into the legal framework, so that essentially the maneuvering that reason had, and the free maneuvering of voluntary free association and contract, could be very clearly demarcated and kept unconfused and unmixed up with a kind of systemic narrative confusion. So as harsh as let's say the clarity that Roman law provides, it was a this is why their thinking is so clear in a lot of ways. So I'm going off into a bit of tangents and things like that, but they are relevant as well. But okay, did I cover everything that I wanted to cover? And I probably should have gone over more, but I've just made like 4 hours of recording today. I think that's about it. Yeah. Oh yeah, so let me just try to summarize the last point properly. So disparity, the grievance of disparity is not relevant. In some sense, the only real issue that I can see in relation to the concept of disparity is, are people prevented from accessing the implements of self-sufficiency? And I also had a kind of a model which is a bit complicated. So like the leg one of self-sufficiency is a kind of relative self-sufficiency, or self-sufficiency in a relative sense, and leg two is a kind of systemic sustainability combined with sufficiency as a kind of composite. And that obviously that condition of a systemic sustainability and sufficiency of a kind of environmental kind, that is something that you can never secure. You can never even hope to secure that. You can hope to secure hope about it. The only thing you can have about that is hope. If you try to secure that in a fixed frame, in a static environment, you are fundamentally engaged in the Moloch enterprise, because that will force you to have to be the biggest fish in the pond. That will force you to have to control all the cards, or have the gun to the head of everyone who collectively controls all the cards. So it's like it doesn't, that's a kind of power game that the and obviously, you could say, well, we should maybe put in some scaffolding in terms of the systemic sustainability and sufficiency. But I would say that leg one is the biggest constituent of providing leg two. That essentially, if you had autarchical cooperative organizations that culturally had an alternative to the market economy and were sustainable within themselves and provided for their own amenities and had a stable culture, that they effectively would be separate from the market and they would be like independent good actors. And if you had enough of them to absorb the dissonance in the game A system, because essentially if game A was failing and it couldn't feed all the people or whatever, then essentially there would be a place that people could exit the market from. I guess if they were even capable of exiting the market in some sense, because maybe some people can't be rescued because of their own psychological makeup. Perhaps they're just too antisocial. Perhaps there's the reason why they couldn't make it in game A in some sense. It's not just because the sociopaths at the top, but because they are addicted to the narrative. They are addicted in some sense to the systemic excuses or whatever, that they're addicted to their own pathological, psychological commensurability with game A. And they just got the short end of the stick. Because apart from being game A devotees, I would say a lot of the successful people in game A, they're not just sociopaths. They're also people who are more ethically imbued, because essentially it's not enough to. The sociopaths in game A might be able to already increase the proficiency or the profitability of something that has already been established. But those sociopaths aren't the ones to sort of actually innovate, to actually move into niches. And in some sense, the cutting edge of game A is the I think the people who would similarly thrive in game B. But obviously, game B, if you sort of started to create it in the way that I've just outlined it, it would need a certain probably basic input before it could actually generate something like a quality of life that would even be remotely commensurate to the medium level of quality of life in game A, perhaps. Because I don't know how possible it is to have. I was thinking, in some sense, the only way to actually have a functioning autarky is that it would have to be. You would have to have many of these groupings that would have some kind of trade with each other, that would have to have some means of transportation, so that they could trade amongst themselves in some sense. Because the idea that you could do everything, you would obviously have to do the most basic things locally. You would have to do food and shelter and access to water and basic amenities. But essentially, if you wanted to create sophisticated electronics, that would require a bit of a one of them would have to own some extractive capacity, or in some sense they would have to generate perhaps some income so that they could buy that material from the market. They would have to perhaps have some, and that would be the stopgap measure, is that you would still, as a collective, try to accumulate some commodity so that you could trade with the market in order to because you don't yet have the autarchical capacity to provide it in-house. So, you just depend on the market for whatever it is that is too expensive for you to do in-house in some sense. And without destroying the integrity of the system, and then essentially the hope would be that eventually that relative sufficiency would actually inculcate into a concrete sufficiency, but essentially the relative sufficiency would be enough in the medium term. The medium term, what did I just say? The interim. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. So I just want to say as well, I guess, in general response to the philosophical matter or the abstract problem that was being contended to in the Stoa argument or Stoa discussion, um, is that I don't believe that you can turn Moloch into an angel. It's not possible. In some sense, the closest thing you can get to that is that essentially you can understand the property or the features of Moloch when you are dealing with game A. So in some sense, if you were in some kind of diplomacy with game A, then you would have to model their their activity as the kind of Moloch thing, and then you could try to use that against them. You could try to game that against them. You could create a kind of um, counter thesis, incentive, counter uh, antithetical incentive thing that, like, is in some sense it wouldn't make Moloch good, but it would sort of stalemate it. It would stalemate it into a predictable identity that then you could have a stable trading relationship with, or a working relationship with. You would be able to stabilize its voracious escalating property into sort of countermanding itself into a stable terminal that you could do, that you could act some kind of process against. So in some sense you could use it to confect a stable relation, a stable pattern of relations, or a stable lay of the land in some sense. So and making it stable in that sense essentially would only be stable through the interactive process that then you that of how you deployed this conversion of Moloch into this thing. But the conversion itself is not a self automatically fixing. It doesn't fix the world after you set it in motion. It doesn't do that. It's by the ongoing practice, and it's somewhat inculcated into the model of what you're dealing with. So it's a faculty of understanding what you're dealing with, so that it doesn't deploy its nefarious, insidious erosion and corrosion um, of what it is that you're doing. So essentially, if you can work out a plan that sustains its efficacy in relation to working with Moloch, then you've tamed Moloch in some sense. But you wouldn't have converted it. In some sense, you're using the property of Moloch to force it, in some sense, to play a role. And in some sense, you can even get into complicated things, because at the point at which you've tamed it, you might also get people that are operating those structures, and then they try to operate them in good faith relative to some kind of weird, where you actually need them to play the Moloch role in order to keep the armistice, to keep the process working in a positive way, and then they'll try to like make it work in a more positive way, and they'll fuck it up. That's the kind of problem that you would actually get into, is when they stop playing the role in some sense. But you've tamed their game into, but you haven't tamed it in every way relative to when they're just doing it by themselves, but relative to when you're in terms of how you've plotted them and how your strategy of engaging it. The example that I gave about the relative autarky is one of those things, because essentially that is a I think a systemic model of how you actually manufacture good faith, how you actually create good faith into the system, how you actually forge it into being. Um, under essentially the obviously its immaterial character of, because in some sense good faith, that's just an adjective, that's label that I'm putting onto it, but in some sense that will be that'll be manifested as the intelligence of how it's actually handling the Moloch aspect, and how it's actively taming it and actively getting it to sort of internally condense itself into a stable, um, relatable. In some sense, it'll allow it to see itself, which is why then it'll also try to change, which will be problematic because it'll stop playing the game, and then you'll actually might have to. It might create confusion and problems because the thing is that if you're in game A, we have to tame you as Moloch. Don't think that now you're in game B just because you're dealing with someone who's a game B actor that sort of got a part of a mixed system, as it were, or got a stable interchange between these games, as my sort of general illustration somewhat mapped out. But essentially, that is how you increase the territory of game B. But obviously, in my example, you already have some territory in game B, and the problem here is that there is no territory whatsoever because no one is willing to sort of have that accountability, that active responsibility of, okay, well, let's actually try to make an autarchical, independent actorship, or an agentic um, uh, articulation of an independent market actor in some sense, which in some sense wouldn't be independent right at the start, but it would be relatively independent, and it would hopefully be growing in that relative independence as it's aimed towards establishing a stable autarky, so that then it can be a real good faith actor. It could be it could demonstrably, it could prove to the game A beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was self-reliant and it was stable. And then essentially it could only be a good faith actor because what would it, if its character would be its internal constitution. Its character would be, how does it treat its members? How equal are its members, or how coordinated are its members? How sophisticated do they interact, and do they make decisions together? And how, sort of, what is the fidelity of their internal constitution? How do they actually run their culture and their affairs? That they then become a beacon of whatever that is. And that is not necessarily going to be a good thing. It's hard to orchestrate that. Those are hard problems to solve. Those are hard challenges to overcome. And that is the real work of being a revolutionary, is actually confronting those things. And I think that they're much more psychological than they are anything else. They're not just, you can't just try to define those problems as sociological problems. They're not. They're preeminently, the sociological space is somewhat a mirror of the psychological space. But anyway, just look at my other videos on this sort of subject. But that's the actual challenge in some sense. And until we have psychological solutions to those issues, it's very hard to even imagine even beginning this, because I think people almost, they prefer the game. They prefer the mythology that game A provides in order to conceal their own insufficiency or whatever, in terms of orchestrating and understanding, and being in a mode of good faith, and having to be in a mode of good faith. Game A allows you to sort of, you can disguise your bad faith. It's pre-excused in some sense, um, and in some sense there might be elements of that need to be recreated within game B. That you have to actually allow people the ability to exert a kind of leverage, of a kind of there should probably be a status economy. I don't think you're going to be able to have a society without status. You might not have economic class. Maybe there should be some elements in that you can, but it should be accessible to everyone in some sense, that you can choose the role that you want to take. That if you take a leadership role, that although you have a kind of political power, you have a diminished other forms of power. That you have sub games, and obviously those might not even, you know, how to manage that is, perhaps there should be game pieces that people essentially are allowed to switch between, but it costs them something to switch between them. They can't just do it, 3 times a day or something like that, and they have to sort of transfer the one into another or something like that, and maybe people should almost be forced to change their game piece. They are not allowed to stay in one. You know, you know, you're going to have to do something to allow people to inhabit the actual psychological space that they are actually at. You can't just say, no, 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 you should be a grown up, mature human being. When you're not a grown up, mature human being, you need to actually function as an immature human being, and you need your society to give you that leeway and to be that immature so that you can then change in the future, or something like that. And I mean, so typology and psychology probably, this gets very freaky when you get into these sorts of circumstances, because it has to be done. It's not. I didn't finish the sentence. It has to be done intelligently. It can't just be done in an orchestrative sense from the top down. It has to be done with real compassion to the human condition, and a real understanding to fathom the human condition, and also to know where to draw the lines in some sense, in what cannot be, um, what's the word, seeded into giving. You can't let certain pathologies take hold as they have in game A. Um, all my descriptions of cluster B stuff are a testament to that, essentially. But understanding that. Anyway, okay, I'm going to stop this recording now. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say.